Chapter 1351, Seizing the Opportunity. While transmitting information to the mandated punishers, Alger quickly came up with a plan in his mind. He was to immediately pray to the Lord of Storms, hoping to obtain the Lord's blessings or help. Then, he would immediately rush underground and use his Beyonder powers to forcefully suppress the 3 Grade 1 sealed artifacts inside Azure Gate. During this process, if the Lord of Storms responded to his prayers, or if the abnormality regarding the seal ended in time, there was naturally no need for him to consider any other response. However, if neither of the 2 outcomes occurred, and he began to find it difficult to handle the situation, then he would seek Mr. Fool's help. To Alger, once he had to do so, no matter what method he used or how he concealed it, it would be difficult for him to escape the fate of being suspected. After all, it was unbelievable for a single person to suppress 3 Grade 1 sealed artifacts single-handedly. When the time came, his only option was to immediately abandon his post after the abnormality ended, or the seal began working again. His departure would waste all his years of diligence and hard work, causing him to lose his post as cardinal, which he had painstakingly obtained. However, compared to his own life, this was a price he was willing to pay. As for the consequences resulting in him almost not having any chance of obtaining the Book of Calamity, Alger didn't care about it at the moment. He was still a great distance from considering such problems. Of course, as a demigod of the Church of Storms and a cardinal, he believed that he was definitely under the watch of the Lord of Storms. After abandoning his job and escaping, he needed the protection of other existences to survive, otherwise his outcome would be unimaginable. And regarding this matter, he could only rely on Mr. Fool. Taking a deep breath, Alger quickly chanted,
"The king ruling over the skies, the emperor who controls the seas, the great god of storms, I pray for your watch and pray for your blessings."
After chanting, Alger reached out with his hand, bringing with him a hurricane as he flew underground. About 10 seconds later, outside the Cathedral of Waves, there was a tidal wave that surged into the air. The blue sea water poured down, enveloping the cathedral in a thick barrier. Inside the barrier, silver bolts of lightning flashed as they drilled underground. Rumble! The lightning struck down like torrential rain, illuminating all of Utopia, illuminating more than half of the Berserk Sea. At that moment, a pitch-black cathedral with many embedded skulls appeared in midair. It was situated above Zaratul and drew all the surrounding lightning towards it, causing bolts of lightning to snake across the countless white skulls, causing the stained glass to reflect a bright light. Rumble! In the places Adam's Corpse Cathedral couldn't shelter, Zaratul's marionettes, Abomination Sua's historical projection, as well as Klein's marionettes, were instantly obliterated by the tempestuous lightning. Then they either vanished or were reduced to tiny marks. Even Roselle Gustav's historical projection that had turned into a flux of information wasn't spared. A strong electromagnetic hurricane wreaked havoc in this city, destroying all information structures. Taking advantage of the moment the visionary was fending off the tyrant, Zaratul took a step forward and entered the void ahead. And this void was connected to another island, one he had previously set in the Berserk Sea, using his Beyonder powers of an attendant of mysteries. The distance between the 2 was reduced to 0. The black-robed, hooded Zaratul quickly vanished into the void illuminated by lightning. But in the next second, he didn't appear on the distant island, but above the Iris's Hotel in Utopia. Just a moment to go, when Zaratul was stunned by the might of the storm. Klein, who was in Saphira Castle, took the opportunity to use the curtain that was draped over his body, and used the power of the Saphira to forcefully graft the void in front of his target to the Iris's Hotel. He had secretly changed Zaratul's key arrangement. This was the suppression effect of a king of angels against a sequence, one angel of the same pathway. Rumble! The ceaseless lightning smote down, enveloping Zaratul, who had long and white whiskers on his face. Zaratul's pitch-black eyes didn't show any change in expression. His body rapidly faded and disappeared in the bolts of lightning. He had only come in the form of a historical void projection. His true body was hiding in a particular fragment in the fog of history. Sitting in the fool's chair, Klein immediately cast his gaze at the grayish-white fog below him, as well as the countless spots of light in the fog. He was temporarily unable to find Zaratul because the latter definitely used a secret fragment of history that only he or a very small number of existences knew. However, being unable to find him didn't mean that Klein could only watch and patiently wait until Zaratul reached his limits and was unable to stay in the fog of history. As the owner of Saphira Castle and an existence with the level of a king of angels, Klein's preliminary control of the Saphira was already enough to complete many things. In the next second, Klein opened the box and summoned the Fool card, accommodating it inside his body. In the blink of an eye, he transformed into the Fool, who wore colorful clothes and a gorgeous headdress. He exuded a deep, terrifying aura, as well as a somewhat ridiculous feeling. The entire Saphira Castle began to shake gently. "Tak!" The Fool Klein held the end of the Staff of the Stars in his right hand and struck the edge of the long mottled table. In the real world, grayish-white fog appeared, one that had a faintly visible ancient palace situated high above. In the ancient and majestic palace, a strange light formed from countless spherical lights quickly outlined itself, emitting an invisible and terrifying suction force. The fog of history instantly boiled as Zaratul's figure quickly appeared in a spot where Klein hadn't lit up. He was hoisted up without being able to stop it. Law of Beyonder Characteristics Convergence. With the help of Saphira Castle, Klein projected the convergence power of Beyonder characteristics into the fog of history. At this moment, Zaratul's black-robed and hooded figure collapsed and became a pale paper figurine. His true body appeared on another island in the Berserk Sea. He quickly used the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder powers to connect the convergence inclination effect to various paper figurines. Seizing the opportunity given to him by the paper figurines, Zaratul quickly made a wish.
The wish for my Beyonder characteristic to temporarily calm down.
Just as he finished speaking and pressed his palms together, he had already caught sight of his fulfilled wish. This allowed him to escape the suction force from Saphira Castle, the Fool card, and the Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder Characteristic Collective. At the same time, he took a step back and accurately stepped on a milky white rock. The stone had long been connected to somewhere else by him, and had been solidified in some form. As Zaratul stepped down, his figure instantly vanished. It was unknown where he had gone, but the stone seemed to experience extreme weathering as it disintegrated. The Fool Klein cast his gaze down from an infinite height and scanned his surroundings, but he couldn't find Zaratul. This meant that the other party had left his line of sight. Without any hesitation, Klein immediately placed his focus on something else. He had already made all the gems on the Staff of the Stars light up as he simulated the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive rules. He changed the location of his body's revival to a marionette that wasn't in Utopia. Previously, a few residents of Utopia had gone to other cities for various reasons. By going there, they would further deepen their relationship with the real world. Klein had chosen a travel enthusiast. He was now in a particular mountain range. As the second half of his resurrection was carried out, Klein took out the Fool card. He summoned the 9 unique spirit world specialties he had prepared previously and placed them together with the curtain. Right on the heels of that, he used the Staff of the Stars to activate the power of Saphira Castle, and once again simulated the powers of the Marauder Pathway's ability to deceive the rules, allowing the 9 spirit world specialties and that curtain to become a part of his body. In the next second, countless fragments of light appeared around the marionette that was halfway up the mountain, and inside the marionette's body, a worm of spirit flew out. It kept fracturing and fused with the fragments of light. Soon the fragments of light condensed into a ball of light as it solidified into Klein's figure. Just as Klein's figure finished outlining, he turned into transparent maggots that scattered in all directions, allowing the curtain and the 9 spirit world specialties to drop to the ground. Then, the worms of spirit completed the reassembly process, and part of them turned into a half-top hat, a shirt, a vest, a formal suit, and trousers. Klein didn't waste any time. He immediately grabbed the curtain and the specialties of the spirit world and began to carefully concoct the potion. To him, this was the best time to advance to Attendant of Mysteries. On the one hand, the effects of the ritual had been completed with the help of the genie. This wouldn't last long, and it would gradually disappear. On the other hand, Adam, who was most likely to destroy his ritual, was being suppressed by the Lord of Storms and had no time to interfere. If he were to consume the potion and advance to sequence 1 at any other time, Klein was really worried that visionary Adam would make use of the sea of collective subconscious to inject a negative emotion into him at a critical moment. That way, losing control was inevitable. The reason why he had called Leodero wasn't to deal with Zeratul, but to hold back the true god, Adam. During the Attendant of Mysteries ritual, there was no way to use the power of Sephira Castle to produce a nascent form of a divine kingdom in advance, isolating Klein from the outside world. This would result in the ritual being unable to establish a connection with the corresponding region in the spirit world, resulting in failure. In less than 10 seconds, a potion that was as dark as the night sea appeared in Klein's palm. At the same time, the figure left in Sephira Castle snapped his fingers, granting the small number of wishes accumulated in the prayer lights and the crimson stars, allowing him to digest the last bit of his miracle invoker potion. The figure inside Sephira Castle immediately faded away, allowing Klein's body to become complete so that he could consume the potion in his best condition. As the lightning lit up the sea once again, Klein raised his right hand and brought the bottle that came from his marionette to his mouth. He gulped down the potion that was as light as air. Chapter 1352, Attendant of Mysteries. As the Attendant of Mysteries potion entered his body, Klein immediately felt a burgeoning feeling. In the blink of an eye, he lost his perception of his body and worms of spirit. He watched helplessly as they dissipated and fused into the spirit world that couldn't be described with ordinary words or common sense. It was as though he was about to disintegrate into abstract and random pieces of information. At that moment, Klein only barely maintained his consciousness and had self-awareness. Just like that, he floated in the spirit world filled with countless strange figures. After losing the ability to sense his body and beyond her characteristics, he began to experience all kinds of thoughts, information, knowledge, symbols, and labels. He completely lost himself and was teetering on the border of fusing with the spirit world. If this continued, Klein would definitely be completely lost, but at this moment there was a connection between the spirit world and his consciousness. That place corresponded to a town. The people inside lived ordinary lives. They had their own names, their stories, and their fates. They intertwined with each other, bringing about complete information in the spirit world, which was the concept of abstractness. This town was eventually destroyed by a calamity and buried in the dust of history. Klein dispersed like a mist, almost fusing into the spirit world's body. Under the guidance of fate, he fused with the spirit world projection of the different utopian marionettes, allowing him to become corporeal again. Bam! Deep underground in the Cathedral of Waves, in a room that was no longer sealed, Alger extended his hands and pressed down on the door in front of him. The surface of the door was blue in color, with numerous mysterious and odd reliefs protruding out. It was ajar, and there was no light behind the door. It was unknown which world it was connected to. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own. At this moment, a stream of water silently surged out, eroding the surrounding area. Bang! Alger's feet exerted strength, causing the ground to crack and spew out scarlet, nearly white, lava. This was a calamity he had created. His goal was to prevent the darkness from advancing. However, after the surging lava entered the darkness, it disappeared without a trace. The darkness shrank back a little and paused for a second before continuing its corrosion. Boom! Alger continuously created hurricanes, torrential rain, and lightning calamities, blocking the darkness again and again. He held the azure gate firmly with both hands, not letting it open further. If he were to only face this Grade 1 sealed artifact, Alger would have been completely fine. He would even have the capacity to attempt sealing it, but at that moment, he still had 2 similarly dangerous items around him. This forced him to sing loudly. He used the melody of death to influence his surroundings and disrupt the operations of the other sealed artifacts. Then, He built a wall formed from blue seawater beside him. However, the wall was slowly being dyed grayish-white, as if it had been petrified. Yet the pandemonium didn't yield as it extended towards Alger's body. Thoughts raced through Alger's mind as he suppressed his unwillingness and reluctance. He quickly made a decision.
I can last for at most 30 seconds. The Lord of Storms hasn't responded the entire time.
Without any hesitation, he immediately accentuated a hexagonal crystalline snowflake on his palm. This was the mark left behind after he participated in the Tarot Club for the first time. It could substitute the reciting of an honorific name and allow Mr. Fool to cast his gaze over. Blue Mountain Island, within the primitive forest. At the door of Flesh and Blood, spherical lights collapsed and converged in an attempt to undergo a qualitative change. They seemed to form a body consisting of a series of doors. The body wore the blood-colored tidal wave as its robe, as its body constantly warped and changed, reflecting different regions and planets. At this moment, a blinding ray of sunlight shone through the darkness. It descended from the astral world and melted everything it encountered along the way. Other than this ray of sunlight, an inscrutable darkness of the night surged over, attempting to devour Mr. Dor Bethel Abraham, who was seeking to advance to Sequence 0. The land where the altar was quaked violently, tearing open a huge hole in a bid to devour the door of Flesh and Blood and Bethel Abraham, to fall deep into the core and face the chaos sea that contained all possible colors and possibilities. Following that, a blurry light seeped out from the void and enveloped the forest, attempting to restore the basic structure of the trees, mud, and altar. And at the only gap in the light, a pair of brass-colored eyes emerged. They stared at the door of Flesh and Blood and Bethel Abraham, hoping to reflect them into their eyes. Mr. Dor let out a low roar, causing his blood-colored robe to flare up. The robe connected to the evil tide that surged behind the door of Flesh and Blood, spreading out to the crimson moonlight. The moment it touched the moonlight, the inscrutable night that could not be seen gathered on its own. It stretched out its limbs and head, turning into a shadowy female human. It possessed its own life, and its consciousness was no longer controlled by its user. Without any exception, the blinding sunlight transformed into a young man wearing fiery armor. The shaking ground grew eyes and closed its mouth. The screen that was transformed from a faint light revealed terrifying facial features. Around the brass-colored eyes, eyelashes emerged, transforming into wings. These obstructions and interferences fell into chaos, giving Mr. Dor a chance for a breather. Seizing this opportunity, he entered the final step of becoming a god. At that moment, the door of Flesh and Blood suddenly collapsed and covered Mr. Dor's body, making him seem to turn into another person. Klein's body seemed to dissociate into countless people. They had their own preferences, their personalities, their determination, and their fates. They lived in a town known as Utopia. These people quickly lived their short lifespans, waking up under the heavy storm. They came to their senses and realized what their identity was in essence. It was Joe Mingrui and also Klein Moretti. They were also Sherlock Moriarty, Guillermin Sparrow, Dwayne Dantes, and Merlin Hermes. One thing could have many names, but its nature wouldn't change. The people raised their heads and looked up into infinity from the illusory city in the spirit world. They saw the illusory and thin spirit body threads, and they saw a symbol made up of the pupilless eye and the partially contorted lines. With the symbol as the core, Klein's figure outlined itself. His eyes tightly shut. Worms of spirit, bits of Beyonder characteristics, and bits of his self-awareness flew out from the spirit world, corresponding to the Utopia area, and towards Klein's slightly illusory body, allowing it to slowly become corporeal. At this point, there was no clear boundary between Klein's spirit body and his physical body. They were both one and separate, and also in a rather delicate state. In other words, a spirit body could be equivalent to a body of flesh and blood. His physical body could also fuse with his spirit body. As long as Klein was willing, he could switch between two states. Of course, he could also separate his physical body from his spirit body. All of them had their individual traits, and they could be decided based on a mere thought. 2 seconds later, the reassembly process was completed. Klein, who was floating in the depths of the spirit world, opened his eyes. His pupils were dark, without any light. He had already advanced to Sequence 1 and became an Attendant of Mysteries. Without a sound, a grayish-white fog appeared behind him. Above the fog was an ancient palace. Inside the palace stood a door that was stained bluish-black, formed from countless spherical lights. The door of light appeared rather clearly in the spirit world. It separated out a rather blurry phantom and cast it at Klein's body. As the phantom turned into a complicated symbol, it imprinted itself between Klein's brows. The entire spirit world and the real world outside began to gently shake, as though they had encountered an earthquake from afar. At that moment, Klein's surroundings turned dark as illusory stars appeared one after another. They surrounded the strange door of light as though they wanted to lump together. In these illusory stars, the largest two overlapped and corresponded to an area in the real world. The third, fourth, fifth, and sixth stars were located somewhere else. Through these illusory stars, Klein saw Mr. Door and Aemon on a particular island. He saw Antigonus in the dilapidated palace inside the concealed world, and Zaratul, who was hiding somewhere unknown. He saw Palez Zoroast in Leonard's body and dark demonic wolf Kotar. With the help of the changes caused by further deepening his control over Sapphira Castle, Klein found the angels and kings of angels corresponding to the three pathways of mysteries. Of course, such a vision only lasted for a few seconds. Once Aemon and Zaratul reacted and used the correct method to conceal themselves, Klein would no longer be able to lock onto their true bodies. Without any hesitation, Klein raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The staff of the stars that was originally placed in Sapphira Castle had appeared in his palm. He also split a portion of the worms of spirit to let them enter Sapphira Castle to prevent any abnormalities and respond to his believers. After becoming an Attendant of Mysteries, Klein's control over Sapphira Castle deepened, allowing him to take out items from inside at any time. In the next second, the various gems on the staff of the stars lit up as Klein's figure vanished from the spirit world. He instantly wandered to a swamp and arrived in front of Zaratul. Dressed in a hood and a black robe, the white-bearded Zaratul didn't panic. He used his Attendant of Mysteries Beyonder powers to make all kinds of connections as he extended his left hand and grabbed into the void ahead. Gradually, Alger's body turned grayish-white, almost about to petrify. He frowned slightly, wanting to give up, but he stayed underground.
Could it be that Mr. Fool doesn't favor me because of my failure to monitor Verdú?
At that moment, a grayish-white fog appeared in front of him. All the sealed artifacts fell silent. After Mr. Door Bethel Abraham was enveloped by the door of flesh and blood, a familiar voice echoed in his ears. "You wish to bring the disaster back to the real world?" Bethel Abraham's actions instantly slowed down. "Give up. I have a way to deal with it. I'll let you sleep and let you get the peace you want." That familiar voice sounded again. Chapter 1353, Sacrificial Victim. Mr. Door's figure that had shrunk from the ball of light came to a halt as though he had fallen into an intense internal struggle. The layered doors in his body were just a little short of fully being reassembled. Amidst the illusory whooshing sounds, the crimson tide that barely squeezed through the gap in the door of flesh and blood became even more turbulent. The blood-colored robe landed heavily, about to envelop Bethel Abraham once again. However, as it descended, the brass-colored eyes, the young man in the fiery armor, the hazy barrier of light that accentuated terrifying facial features, the ground with opened eyes and closed mouth, and the shadowy woman vanished silently from the world. In that instant, a blazing sun appeared above the forest. Day replaced the night, causing all the shadows to rapidly disperse. This caused the blood-colored robe to rise once again, scattering even more crimson moonlight, causing all the disturbances to return to their mother's embrace. Seizing this opportunity, Mr. Door's illusory eyes closed as he lowered his head. He painfully said the first word after his return to reality.
All right.
His figure completely froze as he raised his right hand and pressed it to his face. The next second, Mr. Dorr lifted his head and wore a crystal monocle on his right eye. A beam of light erupted from the monocle, illuminating the entire world. At that moment, all the errors of the seals that had failed were fixed. Everything that seemed normal showed errors. All the clocks jumped several seconds forward. The Marauder Sequence Zero Errors ritual was to replace someone during their apotheosis ritual, and Mr. Dorr's return seemed to directly trigger his apotheosis ritual. The light converged immediately, and Mr. Dorr had turned into Aemon with his pointed hat and classic black robe. The blasphemer held a simple and unadorned key that seemed to be forged from pure starlight in his hand. Above him, the blood-colored robe descended, wanting to embrace him into its arms. Behind him, the crimson tide angrily squeezed through the remnants of the door of flesh and blood in a last bid to enter the world. In that short moment, the blood-colored moon glowed even brighter, blocking the sun, night, earth, blurry light, and the strange white tower outside. Faced with the corruption from an outer deity, Aemon's lips curled up slightly. He extended his right hand and took out an abnormally ancient stone slab from an unknown location. The first blasphemy slate. Then, he used the stone slab formed from the Chaos Sea to block the remnant opening of the door of flesh and blood. Then he used it as a substitute to receive the falling blood-colored robe. The first blasphemy slate turned illusory, as though it was connected to an infinite sea that contained all the possible colors. The sea surged and swallowed the blood-colored robe, blocking the crimson tide from the cosmos. The already collapsed door of flesh and blood rapidly shrank before quickly disappearing. An angry and terrifying roar resounded in the air from within. In the next second, the crimson moon appeared in the sky. The color quickly faded and turned pure. On it was a huge, distorted crimson figure. Wearing a pointed hat and a classic black robe, Aemon adjusted the monocle on his right eye and waved his hand at the crimson figure and the bright moon that were staring at him. He then smiled and bowed slightly in all directions. In the corpse cathedral that had an erected gigantic cross where countless skulls were watching with their hollow eyes, Adam, who was dressed in a simple white robe, took a look at the ceaseless lightning outside the stained glass. He slowly got up and walked to the pool of blood that Klein had left behind. He bent down and picked up the ancient and mysterious mirror. Following that, he turned around and walked towards the second blasphemy slate. The first figure that Zaratul summoned out of the fog of history was still Roselle Gustav, who wore a dark red coat embroidered with gold thread and had chestnut-colored curly long hair. To this attendant of mysteries, there were quite a number of angels that he got to know in his long life. There were only a few that were stronger than a Sequence 1 Knowledge Emperor. For example, the Antigonus ancestor before he became the half-fool, Angel of Fate Ouroboros, or the Red of War Brass, who could indirectly obtain the strength of the Red Angel. But under such circumstances, Zaratul believed that summoning Roselle Gustav's historical void projection first was safer. Before the Antigonus family's ancestor became the half-fool, he too was a Sequence 1 attendant of mysteries. Therefore, he would be suppressed by the enemy who had deeper control of Sapphira Castle and a level that surpassed most kings of angels. After all, his enemy was the closest to a true god. After Zaratul chose to cooperate with the Rose School of Thought and Adam, the success rate of summoning the Angel of Fate Ouroboros would undoubtedly drop. It wasn't suitable for him to attempt it at a critical moment. The Red of War Brass that could borrow the Red Angel's powers didn't possess the strength directly, so the actual effects produced weren't any stronger than that of Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav. In comparison, Zaratul would definitely choose the historical projection that he was most familiar with and the easiest to successfully summon. His plan was to seize the opportunity that Gehrman Sparrow had directly wandered here, without preparing any historical void projections in advance, to use Knowledge Emperor Roselle Gustav, the Red of War Army Brass, an abomination Sua to hold him back and leave him enough time to create a miracle for himself. As soon as Rozel's figure appeared, he immediately condensed into complicated and illusory symbols in his eyes in a bid to infuse large amounts of miscellaneous and useless knowledge into his target's mind, causing his brain to explode. At the same time, Zaratul used the various connections he had set up in advance to move himself. This swamp was his home ground. As he made slippery and transparent tentacles penetrate the hooded black robe and stretch into the fog of history, he summoned the red of war brass. At that moment, Rozel Gustav's historical projection suddenly turned his head and used a subtle connection to look toward Zaratul's true form. Zaratul's mind was instantly filled with information and useless knowledge. His brain nearly exploded as he was unable to process his thoughts for a short period of time. He froze on the spot, his gaze not even changing. The historical projection, knowledge Emperor Rozel Gustav, that he had summoned had betrayed him. Klein was both surprised and unsurprised by this outcome. It wasn't surprising because this was his own doing. The worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle had already grafted Rozel's present state to the concealed state that Klein had met. The surprising thing was that Adam had never reminded Zaratul to be careful of Rozel Gustav. Klein had previously sensed the coincidences in certain matters. His preparations included using the Fool symbol's connection to Rozel Gustav's seal. Through the corresponding prayer point of light, he could throw a worm of spirit that contained certain words or intent to his fellow earthling who was in deep sleep and awaken him. Then, using a miracle, he could temporarily suppress the corruptive powers of the mother goddess of depravity. Back then, the worst-case scenario that Klein took precautions against was if something happened to him that prevented him from contacting Sapphira Castle. As such, the worms of spirit in Sapphira Castle and the worms of spirit that were scattered in different places would end up losing control and be unable to save him. Once the worm of spirit he gave Rozel mutated, Rozel would know that there was something wrong. He could then use the powers of a Black Emperor to distort order to maintain the worm of spirit's lucidity for a certain period of time. As for what plan the worm of spirit and Rozel would come up with to save himself, Klein didn't know either. This was the real reason why he could hide from Adam. With his experience in the Hall of Truth, Klein knew that he wouldn't have any secrets when facing the visionary. Any rescue plans, be it figured out from the past or on the spot, would be seen and heard clearly by Adam. At his level, the only way to avoid it was if even he himself didn't know how to save himself. Of course, visionary Adam knew without a doubt that Klein had a worm of spirit in Rozel Gustav's Black Emperor mausoleum. He knew that his backup plan definitely came from this, but he wasn't able to pry into the secrets of it because it was contaminated by the mother goddess of depravity. It was a place that had been corrupted by the cosmos, and the thought of prying into Rozel Gustav was like prying into an outer deity. This was the difference in level. It was precisely because of this that Klein could calmly ask all kinds of secrets and read the second blasphemy slate. On the one hand, knowledge was indeed tempting. And on the other hand, he was stalling for time, waiting for the other side to complete the task of rescuing him. At the same time, he didn't want to occupy his mind. Otherwise, he couldn't help but think about how he could save himself. As a result, Klein began to suspect that other than the unknown reasons as to why Adam had shared so many secrets with him was because he was also trying to lure him into thinking of the solutions he would use to save himself, so as to find clues and stop him in advance. Therefore, the question and answer session in the Corpse Cathedral was a clash of minds. Klein had to constantly control himself to prevent his thoughts from going astray. And under this premise, Adam clearly knew that there might be problems with Rozel Gustav, but he didn't remind Zaratul. Regardless of the reason, Klein had no intention of letting the opportunity slip. He immediately raised the Staff of the Stars in his hand and skillfully simulated Amon's Worm of Time's powers. Gong! An ancient modeled stone clock phantom appeared. Its face was separated into 12 different segments by grayish-white and bluish-black colors. Each segment represented a different symbol of time. Gong! One of the 3 needles in the middle of the stone clock jumped, and Zarathul's body froze on the spot. Klein immediately transformed into a maggot vortex that extended countless slippery tentacles. In the middle of the vortex was a strange door of light. The door of light didn't move as the vortex swirled around it. A terrifying suction force forcefully pulled out the Beyonder characteristics within Zarathul's body. This was the method Pallas Zoroast had used to deal with Amun's avatar back then. He had relied on his position to forcibly gather characteristics. Bit by bit, the Beyonder characteristics flew out at an accelerating rate. By the time Zarathul escaped his frozen state and the mental explosion, he was already unable to extricate himself. He could only watch helplessly as he was completely carried into the dark and gloomy maggot whirlpool. A few seconds later, the vortex outlined its body again, and Klein landed his feet on the ground. In the fog of history, Zarathul's figure appeared again and again, but it was impossible for him to retrieve his Beyonder characteristics. In the end, it could only fade away silently, making it difficult for him to completely revive. Klein used the ritual's remnant effects that hadn't completely dissipated and directly swallowed Zarathul's characteristic. He wanted to use this to lower the influence of the celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. As the corpse cathedral was still floating in the sea of lightning, Adam, who wore a simple white robe and had a faint blonde beard, suddenly appeared at the edge of the waters near the ruins of the Battle of Gods. The sea split apart, and a path appeared. It led straight to the spot which was stained with the ancient sun god's blood. It led straight to the giant king's court's projection, the forsaken land of the gods. In the depths of the forsaken land of the gods, at the top of a mountain peak, there was a huge cross erected, and there was an indistinct figure hanging upside down on it. Chapter 1354, This Night. Late at night, the clanging sound of the door and windows opening woke Wendell up from his deep sleep. He warily rolled off the bed and surveyed his surroundings.
What happened? Utopia encountered a super heavy storm?
It wasn't easy for the recently insomniac Wendell to fall asleep, but he had no choice but to get out of bed. His mind was still lethargic, and he looked rather lost. He soon realized that there was no wind blowing in from the open window, nor did the rain enter. It was like he had opened it while sleepwalking to take in fresh air. Wendell suddenly thought of the supernatural events that he had experienced and learned from the dossier. He was reminded of the fear of the unknown that once ruled his heart. He didn't know what else would happen next, nor could he guess what he would encounter. He felt a chill run down his back as he shivered again. At this moment, he heard the commotion outside the door. All sorts of voices entered his ears. There were the loud sounds of running, the sounds of judgment, the declarations of orders to be changed, and unconcealed shouts. Something is wrong with the underground seal. Be on high alert.
Underground seal? What kind of item is sealed beneath the Irises Hotel?
Wendell was surprised and confused. He couldn't help but walk to the door and look around. He then saw an MI9 colleague, who he barely knew, and Colonel Shio Dorecha, who was on duty tonight.
Did MI9 find Utopia because of me? They're here to handle the abnormality.
Wendell instinctively frowned just as the thought flashed through his mind. He discovered that the corridor outside was completely different from the Irises Hotel. Not only were there gas lamps on both sides, but there were also classical candle stands. The floor was very bright, and the ceiling was more than 3 meters high.
This isn't the Irises Hotel.
Wendell suddenly turned around and sized up the room he was in. He quickly recognized that this was his sleeping quarters at MI9 headquarters. His luggage was placed quietly in a corner without any signs of movement. Wendell clearly remembered that he had headed to Utopia through the washroom in his room. He wasn't too confident in the process, so he didn't bring his luggage and only held the subpoena from Utopia's courts. Tap, tap, tap! He quickly ran to the window and looked outside. What greeted his eyes was the garden and lawn at MI9 headquarters.
I'm back in Backland again? Or perhaps I didn't return to Utopia at all. I was just too tired and ended up having a dream in my sleep.
Wendell dazedly walked back to his bed and sat down. After about 10 seconds, he suddenly jumped up and picked up his coat from the ground. Then he saw the utopian subpoena in the inner pocket of the coat when it should be inside a drawer. Wendell fell silent, as though he had become a statue. Travel columnist Monica also woke up from the banging of the doors and windows. She sat up straight, pulled the blanket up, and placed it in front of her chest. The sleepy-eyed Monica's first reaction was that a robber had barged into the hotel. She was about to scream and call for the police, but in the next 10 to 20 seconds, Monica didn't hear any footsteps entering her room. However, there were more and more people gathered along the corridor. What happened? It doesn't seem like a hurricane. Was it a prank? Damn clown, if I knew who it was, I would definitely kick his ass hard. The voices of discussion were mixed with all kinds of curses. Monica didn't think much of it when she heard it. Instead, she thought of using the crowd's discussion to consider the reason underlying the paranormal activity and write it in her traveling column. But as she listened, she gradually realized something was amiss.
How could Iris's hotel have so many guests?
She remembered clearly that on this floor there were at most 5 rooms with guests. This included her room. Méliès. At that moment, Monica thought of the ghost stories she had heard. She immediately felt as if there were wraiths and shadows outside. She had originally stretched her feet towards the bedside, preparing to leave the room to participate in the discussion and grasp more details for her writing material. But now she retracted her feet and curled into a ball, trembling. Ow! Oh! A few seconds later, she heard a man say,
I asked the hotel owner, and he said that he had no idea what happened. Perhaps there was a short storm just now. Return to your room and get some rest. Remember to lock the windows. Jan, I have to get up early tomorrow to go to the Royal Museum.
Royal Museum.
Monica was stunned. As a travel columnist, as a traveler who had been in Utopia for a long time, she naturally knew that there was no Royal Museum. In the Lowen Kingdom, a museum with such a royal name would definitely be in Backland. To take a steam locomotive from Utopia to Backland required many hours. Even if he woke up early, he wouldn't be able to arrive before the Royal Museum closed. Monica was puzzled. She slowly lifted the blanket. She heard the sound of the door and windows closing continuously. She got off the bed carefully and walked towards the door. During this process, she gradually saw the room through the moonlight.
Hiss!
Monica almost screamed.
This wasn't the guest room she had slept in previously. Regardless of the layout or arrangement, they were completely different.
The ghost stories that she had thought of earlier surged into her mind again, causing her legs to give way, and she almost couldn't support herself. Just as Monica's teeth were chattering, she saw a hotel name card on the table. It was prepared for guests. If she brought it out, she would be able to get someone to guide her back when she was lost, even if she didn't know the language. Monica subconsciously approached it and used the moonlight to identify the words on the name card. Carl Pensa Hotel, Backland, Westboro, 19 Morning Street.
Backland, Westboro. Backland.
Monica's eyes widened as she felt like space and time had gone topsy-turvy. Backland, Hillston Borough, in a house with a fireplace. Fours heard the door and windows open, but she didn't immediately wake up. This was because she had fallen into a strange nightmare and couldn't break free. She dreamed that her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, had been influenced by the family's sealed artifact, dying in front of her, with blood dripping. She dreamed that she had lost control and mutated, turning into a series of starlight insects that warped into the shape of doors. She couldn't help but fly towards a door of flesh and blood. She dreamed that the apocalypse had dawned, and the surging blood-colored tide had drowned the entire world, preventing Shio, Gehrman Sparrow, and company from escaping. Finally, Force escaped the dream and sat up, panting heavily. Roque. As a demigod, one who was once an astrologer, she knew what such a dream meant. She hurriedly suppressed her emotions and looked up ahead. The glass on the oriel window in the bedroom all bore open at some point in time.
Something must have happened. Furthermore, it has a certain relationship with the apocalypse, the Abraham family, and the apprentice pathway.
Fours silently muttered to herself before standing up and wearing a cloak, preparing to teleport to her teacher to confirm his safety. Such a change made her feel a sense of urgency towards advancing to Sequence 3 or even Sequence 2. After learning about the apocalypse from Mr. Fool and the World Gehrman Sparrow, Fours had actually been working hard, but the secret sorcerer potion wasn't something that she could digest in a short period of time. Furthermore, without making any contributions, she couldn't bring herself to ask her teacher for the Wanderer's formula and ingredients. Of course, if she was willing, she could have obtained it from Mr. Dorr. However, how could she have been bewitched after receiving all kinds of reminders? Phasing away, Fours vanished from the room. A few seconds later, she appeared at Dorian Gray Abraham's residence and saw her teacher sitting there, pressing down on his heart as though he had been frightened. Fours asked carefully,
Do you need medicine?
She had purchased medicine from Mr. Moon to treat ailments of age. Dorian took a deep breath and shook his head.
There's no need.
Fours immediately relaxed.
Teacher, I dreamed that you were affected by the negative effects of the sealed artifact. The windows and doors around me had undergone unnecessary changes, so I came over to take a look.
Dorian looked up at the window open and said with a serious expression,
Your dream wasn't wrong. I nearly died just now, but at the most critical moment, the seal came into effect.
Having said that, he suddenly stood up and said to Fours,
Quick! Bring me somewhere else. I'm worried that something might happen to the other family members.
Without any hesitation, Fours immediately grabbed her teacher's arm and asked for the exact location. Their figures rapidly faded away and disappeared. After traveling through the spirit world that was covered in gray fog for several seconds, Fours and Dorian suddenly left their present environment and landed in a place that looked like a study. There were quite a few people standing there. They were members of the Abraham family who wielded different sealed artifacts and could travel. "I," Dorian blurted out.
Velos? Why are all of you here?
Vilos and the others shook their heads at the same time, both confused and terrified. In the next second, countless dazzling stars appeared out of the void. The starlight quickly gathered together, turning into objects that fell to the ground one after another. There was a miniature door of starlight, a crystal ball formed from insects. There was a translucent, strange-looking key, a resplendent torch that burned slightly. For some reason, names after names appeared in Dorian and Company's minds. Sequence 3, Wanderer Beyond Her Characteristic. Sequence 4, Secret Sorcerer Beyond Her Characteristic. Sequence 1, Key of Stars Beyond Her Characteristic. Sequence 2, Planeswalker Beyond Her Characteristic. Furthermore, there wasn't just one of each Beyond Her Characteristic. There were even two, Sequence 1, Key of Stars Beyond Her Characteristics. In addition, there were 3 Planeswalker Beyond Her Characteristics, and even more of the rest. The key members of the Abraham family and Fours slowly turned a gap, unable to close them for a long time. By the time all the Beyond Her Characteristics dropped to the ground, nothing abnormal happened again. There was silence. Chapter 1355, Wrapping Up the Matter. The nearly frozen silence lasted for nearly 10 seconds before the Abraham family members uniformly cast their gaze at Fours. After sensing the mixed emotions of wariness, guardedness, and fear, Fours took the initiative to take a few steps to the side and warned,
Be careful of the negative effects.
even if the Beyond Her characteristics hadn't fused with the surroundings and formed sealed artifacts, they contained certain negative effects. However, most of the time, it would only have effects from direct contact. Of course, the Beyond Her characteristics here were all high-sequence Beyond Her characteristics. No one could be certain if they would actively expand their area of influence. Seeing that Fours didn't show any obvious greed, Dorian nodded and said,
When you finish digesting the Secret Sorcerer potion, you can consider advancing to Sequence 3 Wanderer. I'll give you the potion formula and prepare the corresponding ingredients for you. Of course, at this level, the higher the sequence, the greater the danger you face. This is an objective situation. It doesn't change because of your personal will and arrangements. When the time comes, you can decide whether you wish to advance or not.
He said these words because he cared for his student, and on the other hand, he wanted to assure her that whatever the Abraham family possessed was equivalent to her possessing it. No one would treat her as an outsider and deliberately make things difficult for her on the matter of raising her sequence. This could effectively eliminate the heat brought by greed. And after obtaining so many high sequence Beyonder characteristics, Velos and the other members of the Abraham family weren't unwilling to part with a Wanderer Beyonder characteristic. They even believed that using it to exchange for peace was absolutely worth it. After all, there was only one demigod here, Fours. Without the time to bring out their Grade 0 sealed artifacts, and because of the ineffectiveness of the seals, the Abraham family members didn't dare take out most of the Grade 1 sealed artifacts. Under such a situation, Fours had the ability to finish all of them off. Faced with her teacher's promise, Fours tersely acknowledged.
Was the door to the concealed space opened?
She thought that the high sequence Beyonder characteristics in front of her were all from the Abraham family's treasure vault and had been thrown into the real world due to the recent abnormality. However, she did feel that there were too many of them.
No.
Dorian slowly shook his head, looking confused. The other Abraham family members remained silent, equally confused. No one would believe that treasure would fall from the skies unless it happened before their eyes.
Should we pray to Mr. Fool?
Fours tried giving a suggestion. Dorian, who had a vague guess, immediately looked at the other Abrahams. He saw the ones who had changed faiths to Mr. Fool nod in agreement. Those who hadn't changed faiths were clearly hesitant and eager to object. After some consideration, Dorian composed himself and said,
Gather the ones with negative area of effect traits while using the correct method. Prevent them from combining with the surroundings. I'll pray to Mr. Fool at the side.
All right.
The few members of the Abraham family hesitated for 2 seconds before agreeing. Following that, they seized the opportunity to identify the characteristics and attempt to gather them. After some of the members had obtained a certain amount, Dorian finally retreated to Fours' side and bowed his head to pray to Mr. Fool. Soon, a grayish-white fog and an ancient palace deep in the fog appeared in front of him. A high and solemn voice resounded in his ears.
These are the relics of Mr. Door. Your bloodline curse has been completely removed.
Relics of Mr. Door. Relics. Dorian ruminated over the word and opened his eyes, casting his gaze at the high sequence Beyonder characteristics. He looked on silently, his vision gradually blurring. Eastchester County, the Hall family manor. Alfred and the others, who had just figured out the source of the explosion and the enemy attack shout, saw the doors and windows opening at the same time as they crashed into the walls. During this process, several pieces of glass shattered. There is indeed something abnormal. Alfred raised his hand with a solemn expression. He said to his adjutant, squire, personal guards, and bodyguards,
Retreat back to the main house to prevent any accidents that might happen next. At the same time, send a telegram to the Archbishop of Eastchester Diocese and request for assistance.
He felt that the most important thing right now was not to investigate the anomaly, but to protect his father, mother, and sister. He had plenty of time to do the former after daybreak. But if anything happened to the latter, it would be impossible to make up for it. After returning to the manor's main house and arranging for strict patrols, Alfred walked into the living room and said to Earl Hall,
There was indeed something abnormal, but the guard couldn't describe what he saw. He only felt extreme fear at that moment.
Earl Hall nodded calmly and said,
We'll do further investigations after daybreak. Sit down and get some rest.
Beside him, Audrey was holding her mother's arm as she quietly listened to her father and 2 brothers talking. Of course, this was only an image. She had been continuously releasing virtual personas in an attempt to find the reason for the sudden opening of doors and windows from the memories of eyewitnesses. After a few minutes, she ended the investigation, somewhat disappointed. For the time being, she temporarily attributed it to the influence left behind by the Mind Dragon, Airihog, and Mr. Wrath. At that moment, she realized that the golden retriever, Susie, had a strange look in her eyes. She quickly sent out a virtual persona and entered the mind island of the other party's soul to have a private conversation.
What did you discover?
Audrey asked directly. On Susie's mind island, a voice resounded.
I smell a thick scent of blood. At the edge of the manor, it happened some time before the doors and windows opened. Yes, it happened about 10 seconds after the explosion.
After hearing that, Audrey pursed her lips and fell silent for a few seconds.
Go take a look.
Susie immediately stood up and tiptoed out of the living room. She left the manor's main house from a side door on the first floor. During this process, there would be people looking at her from time to time, but they didn't mind her and didn't attempt to stop her. After all, she was just a dog who had mastered psychological invisibility. After walking the path to the furthest building from the manor's main house, Susie twitched her nose and chose an open window before jumping in. Then she saw a bloody corpse on the bed. Its skin had shed, and what she saw was equivalent to Audrey seeing it through the virtual persona that she planted in her mind island. In the living room inside the main house of the manor, Audrey, who was holding her mother's arm, lowered her head. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes swept slowly and deeply across her family's faces. Earl Hall, Lady Catelyn, Hibbert, and Alfred. She maintained her silence, becoming increasingly silent. Bayham, inside the Cathedral of Waves. Alger, who was wearing a robe embroidered with the storm symbol, walked out from the underground area one step at a time. He nodded at the mandated punishers and priests who were waiting by the sides.
The seals were restored to normal in time. Jave, you can return the items under your watch.
Yes, Your Eminence.
The mandated punishers, priests, and bishops heaved a sigh of relief as they struck their left chest with their right fists. Alger didn't say anything else as he responded with the same salute. After returning to his room, he slowly looked around. He took a deep breath and found a seat to sit down.
The fool that doesn't belong to this era.
Alger silently prayed to Mr. Fool, expressing his thoughts of preparing to leave the Church of Storms. The explanation that the seal was restored to normal in time could only convince relatively low-level members of the Church. It was impossible to hide from any cardinal or high-ranking deacon, much less the pontiff and the Lord of Storms. And if he didn't get Mr. Fool's approval and protection, Alger didn't dare leave the Church of Storms so casually. He would definitely suffer the wrath of a god. A few seconds later, he saw the familiar, boundless gray fog and heard Mr. Fool's reply.
Okay. Go to the Church of the Sea God.
Phew! Alger relaxed, stood up, and took off his storm robe. After changing into a linen shirt, brown jacket, and pantaloons, Alger looked at the cardinal robe on the table and fell silent for a while. Then, he reached out and folded the robe neatly. After carefully examining it for a few seconds, Alger retracted his gaze and flew out of the cathedral through the open-board window by controlling a strong wind. He first flew to the bell tower and landed on the top. He looked down at the surrounding streets and down at Bayham. During this process, Alger stepped on the edge of the roof and slowly circled it. Finally, he closed his eyes. A hurricane suddenly stirred as it swept Alger towards the Church of the Sea God. In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein silently sat on the high-backed chair belonging to the Fool. His figure would occasionally turn incorporeal, as though he was wearing a mysterious and classical black robe. During such instances, he wore a hood that made his face indiscernible. At other times, he would return to normal. However, he was enveloped in a faint gray fog. The frequency of this change gradually slowed down, and every time Klein transformed into the black-robed, hooded figure, slippery tentacles with strange patterns growing would extend out from under his clothes. These nearly transparent tentacles flailed about, striking everywhere as if taking the palace for itself. After a while, Klein's figure finally stabilized. Out of habit, he raised his right hand and rubbed his temples as he muttered to himself.
The awakening of the celestial worthy's will is faster and more intense than I expected. If I hadn't devoured Zarathul's beyonder characteristic and used the remnant mental imprint to balance it and stalled for time, I wouldn't have been able to adjust my state and stop him from awakening.
However, this made Klein's mental state rather unstable. And he didn't lose control because his Miracle Invoker potion had already been completely digested, and the new Attendant of Mysteries Beyond Her characteristic he consumed was mostly digested shortly after consumption. The identity of the world was a blessed of the owner of Sapphira Castle, making it directly equivalent to the Attendant of Mysteries. Therefore, Klein had already acted the role of Attendant of Mysteries for a very long time, and it had been quite successful. As for the second Attendant of Mysteries Beyond Her characteristic, he still needed some time to digest it.